He was just a simple villager until he opened his eyes. In the body of a prince, history called the Tyrant. A man destined to die by his own court's betrayal. Every ally hides a dagger, every smile hides a plot. Determined to change fate, Prince Rudolph swears off cruelty, plots, and power. All he wants is a quiet life and the girl from his memories. But in a palace where mercy looks like madness, can kindness save a condemned soul? Let's find out. The story begins in a dark room of the castle, where the protagonist was attacked by an assassin with a dagger, and he thought that the right of succession, the child of his mistress, a selfish tyrant prince, there were enough reasons to become a target. The assassin stopped the dagger in front of his face and asked Prince Rudolph why he didn't resist. He calmly looked at him and thought that he didn't do this because he knew his future. A few hours ago, in the Baldric Empire, the palace of Scorpio, the fourth prince, several servants walked down the corridor and said that 7 days had passed since the fourth prince was poisoned and things were not going well. It would be good if he could just die. 2 maids entered the prince's room, were very surprised when they saw him sitting on the bed and loudly said that he was awake. He had slept for 7 whole days. Maya should call a doctor quickly. They both started loudly telling everyone else what had happened, and he, with a calm expression on his face, thought that it was too noisy here. He will not die, so they don't have to worry about him so much. Many servants with not very happy faces gathered in his room and watched intently as the doctor performed an examination and asked if he could tell him his name and age. MC, with a calm expression on his face, gave his name and said that he was 14 years old. The doctor looked at him and asked if he knew his past. He said that he was the 4th prince of the Baldic Empire. His father was the emperor. His mother gave birth to him only to become part of the imperial family. All his relatives despise him because he is the son of a mistress, and not long ago he was poisoned. The doctor asked him to stop, gathered his things, and said that it seemed like there were no problems. He could rest. He hoped that he would recover quickly. He and the servants left his room, and he began to look around. He thought he was almost sure that those servants were watching him. They would surely inform their real boss about this. His brothers and the queen, after all, he was a nuisance to them. 2 maids walked down the corridor and asked if she thought the prince was a little strange. It was as if he was too calm, although he almost died. Who knows what's on his mind? There are rumors that there are a lot of spies here. The prince has no allies. Any moment can become the moment of an assassination attempt on him. She is sure that he is full of anxiety and fear. MC, with a calm expression on his face, washed himself in his room and thought that he knew that he would live for at least another 10 years. After all, he got into the past 300 years ago and knows history. He remembers being on the verge of death because of poison. His memories from a past life. He grew up in a village in the countryside, in the distant future of this era. After he died as an ordinary villager, his soul returned back in time and space. He was reincarnated in the body of Rudolph I Baldic. He made a fuss if he didn't like something, shouted, cursed, and ordered unreasonable things. He was a hopeless tyrant prince. Before his memories returned, he was a terrible person. He is disgusted by the stupidity he showed in the past. How can he live on now? This future will tell him its secrets. At that moment, an assassin attacked him, jumping through the window, knocked him to the ground, and held a dagger to his face. He called out to the prince and asked why he didn't resist. Wasn't he afraid of the assassination attempt? Although it doesn't matter, His Highness must prepare. He was unable to strike because a guard shot him in the hand with a bow and loudly told him to move away from the prince. The assassin realized that the assassination attempt had failed and ran out the window. The guards loudly said that they must catch this killer. Wait. The prince's safety comes first. A maid came up to him, called his name, and asked if he was okay. The protagonist, with a calm expression on his face, sat up and said that they should clean up the shards of glass and leave, and that he needed to think. He lay down on the bed and thought with a nervous smile that he was saved. Even though he knew that he wouldn't die, he was still scared. This man really tried to kill him. As soon as he thinks about the fact that he could have been stabbed, well, this book seems real. Wilhelm, a military biography. It was his favorite book in his past life, an epic poem praising this man's life. First, the attempted murder, then the poison. He looked up with a slightly worried look and said that even though he knew about the attempt, he still didn't want to relive that experience. He thought it was an assassination attempt. In other words, he knew he wouldn't be killed now. He would be killed in about 10 years at the age of 25. According to his military biography, Rudolph's suspicions were strengthened by repeated assassination attempts. He would kill all his brothers, and the cruel emperor would leave his name in history as a tyrant of unprecedented cruelty. His personality probably fractured due to fear and suspicion. If history goes according to plan, he would kill all his brothers and become a tyrant, unloved and unwanted. He would curse everything and die in agony. He got dressed with a serious expression, started to leave, and thought that he would survive, fight this fate, and outlive it. He knew what would happen in the future and must change history. He took the box where he kept the coin from the closet and remembered how the girl had given it to him. He thought that his first step to changing history was to figure out who his enemies were and eliminate them. He would solve all the problems in this place. He went to his office, brought 2 maids, and said that when he was sick, His work was delayed and eventually stopped. He wanted them to bring him the accounting statement of the Scorpio Palace. One of them asked, "His Highness, is something wrong?" He asked for the statement so suddenly, although he had never done this before. The protagonist, with a calm expression, told Tapple that until now he regretted shifting all the work to her. He would soon be 15 years old and needed to learn to handle official duties. She said that he could leave all the affairs to them. He must be exhausted after the assassination attempt. He, with a calm expression, said that he was completely fine. She should just bring him this statement. She said that they were looking for the killer, putting the prestige of the Imperial Palace at stake. They will definitely find the ledger. He can rest assured. He said that his killer was probably sent by one of his brothers. They will find a random person and make him guilty. In any case, the ledger. He didn't have time to finish because she suddenly hugged him, started crying, and said loudly that she was really sorry to hear this. Just think, he accepted that he would have to fight against his brothers. She held his shoulders and said loudly that he should remember that she had cared for him as his personal servant since birth. It was she who changed his diapers on behalf of his mother. As his servant, she swears by this brooch that no matter what danger awaits him, she will always be on his side. She asks him to rely on her. He noticed her sly smirk while she hugged him and thought that it was she, the one who discreetly lined her pockets. According to the military biography, she was always on the side of the cruel emperor. A woman full of poison used his name as a cover to commit all her extravagant acts. Women of this kind will commit atrocities even when there is peace. He tried to set a trap by asking her for a statement, and her bad behavior implies that she is guilty. He pushed her away from him and thanked her for these words. MC thought that for the sake of his peaceful life, she needed to leave. He would not allow her to keep silent about such a thing. He needed irrefutable evidence. He said that he was glad that she thought so of him. In that case, he asks to teach him if he doesn't understand something after looking at the statement. Now that everything is decided, he wants to eat first. He asks to bring dinner for him, after which he will start working. Tapple started to leave the office and agreed with him. After some time, he finished eating, thanked her for the food, and thought that she was probably now trying to destroy the evidence. Walking along the corridor, he noticed a maid named Maya, who was sitting in front of a broken jug. He came closer and asked what happened. She, without turning to him, said that the handle of the jug broke and she dropped it. Probably it was because it was too old. He said with a smile that the furniture in his room was also very old and always caused inconvenience. She laughed and asked, "Everything is worn out, isn't it?" She was very surprised when she realized who she was talking to, began to bow, loudly apologized to His Highness, and said that she would clean everything up right now. He asked her to calm down and thought that he really was causing them fear. She was about to run for a rag but stopped because he asked her name. She turned to him, stated her name, and he said with a friendly smile that, actually, he wanted to ask her for something. At the same time, Tapple said loudly that they should work faster. His Highness always takes a walk after eating. They should make sure that the statement corresponds to reality before he returns. Rudolph entered the office and said loudly that they were late. How much longer should he wait for them? She turned to him, called him, and he said that he was already tired of waiting. What were they doing here? She said with a smile that she was checking the accounting book. There should be no flaws in what His Highness sees. They looked at each other with serious faces. He took one of the books and said that then they should begin without further ado. He began to read it intently and thought that they had done a great job of adjusting the statement. They managed to balance the cash flow. He closed the book and said with a small smile that he did not see anything strange here. Tapple said that of course, she kept it meticulously. A servant approached the door and noticed two other servants and asked what they were doing there. One of the eavesdroppers gestured for them to be quiet and said that the most interesting part was beginning. At that moment, he pointed to a line in the book and said that then she should allow him to ask if that was the furniture expense. Why did she spend so much on furniture? The servants were worried about what they heard, and she calmly told His Highness that this was a palace. The Emperor had given him this Scorpio palace to manage. What did he think was the most important thing in managing a castle? Of course, it was dignity. Furniture that undermined the dignity of the imperial family must be noticed. The protagonist asked if she meant that she always replaced old furniture with new. She calmly agreed and said that there were so many things that needed to be replaced that they didn't have enough budget. Several servants continued to eavesdrop on their conversation, and he asked, "Considering this, why is there so much old furniture here?" She started to worry about it, and he said that it was not only this room. From the corridors to the lamps, this palace was full of old furniture. Even in his room, everything was worn out, not even a trace of dignity. He took out a book and asked if she knew what it was. At first glance, this book seemed to be an exact copy of the old one he had seen earlier, but strangely, there was still half the budget left. Her statement was fake, wasn't it? She started biting her nails out of worry, couldn't believe it, and asked who gave it to him. Maya entered the room and, looking a little worried, said that she did it. He looked at the book with a smile and said that she found this statement for him. Tapple, with a displeased expression on her face, said loudly that this was impossible. It was a fake book. She refused with a serious look and said that this book was real. She showed a page of the book and said that here is the proof. The seal of the Scorpio Palace is placed here. MC, with a calm smile, said that this seal means an official document and only he has it. Even she can't forge this seal. She silently clenched her teeth out of anxiety, and he snapped his fingers, and at that moment the guards entered the room. He ordered them all to be taken away, and the servants who were responsible for this loudly said that this man was blackmailing her. He called her a traitor and loudly said that it was she who pushed him to do this. Tapple resisted the guards and loudly said that she looked after him for 15 years and was devoted to him. Does he really have no compassion at all? He will die a bad death. He silently listened to everything she said. She tried to reach him and loudly said that she knew who poisoned him and sent the killer. Everyone was very surprised by what they heard, but he did not turn to face her, and she loudly asked His Highness for forgiveness. He turned to her with a serious expression and asked, "She says she knows who sent the assassin?" He already knew that it was her. She was shocked by this and wanted to ask something, but the guards took her away, and he thought that due to repeated assassination attempts, he had become imaginary to everything. He killed his brothers and became emperor, completely relying on Tapple, the only person next to him. Poison, murder. She certainly made these attempts so that he would become imaginary to everything and rely on her. She continued to try to resist, but the guards took her out of the office and closed the door. The servants were very surprised by everything that had happened, after which they decided to return to work. Rudolph remained standing, took a deep breath, and thought that thanks to this, cases of fraud should become fewer. He stopped hiding his excitement and thought that it was so crazy. He tried to act like a real tyrant, but he wouldn't be like that anymore. He turned around, thanked Maya, and said that she saved him. She wanted to say something with a slightly worried look, but couldn't make up her mind. She looked at him when he called her by name and said that from now on, she was his personal servant. She was very surprised by what she heard and asked loudly, "Is he sure about this?" He agreed and said that the other servants would consider her a traitor for accusing Tapple. She would lose her place as a new servant. She looked at him with a slightly worried look, then bowed and loudly told His Highness that she was very grateful to him and would do her best. He walked down the corridor with a confident smile and thought that he was sure that he had become a cruel emperor because he didn't have reliable allies. He needs to get more allies so he can change history and live longer. A month later, he was sitting at the table in the garden and thought that in order to get more allies, he first needs to find a bride. A girl was walking towards him and said that it was a very beautiful garden. Maya walked in front of her, turned around, and thanked her for this compliment. The girl approached him and said that she was glad to meet him. She is the eldest daughter of the Farkrantz family, Lisbeth. To be chosen as the bride of the fourth prince is a great honor. She sat down on a chair in front of him, and the protagonist began to tremble with anxiety, looking at her, and thought that if he married this girl, he would be killed. She looked at him with a suspicious expression and said that this flower had a very pleasant scent. He examined her and thought that her shiny black hair shone like onyx. Her radiant blue eyes sparkled like aquamarine. A beautiful, unfamiliar girl sat before him, but for him, an engagement to her meant inevitable death. He knows history 300 years in advance and knows the fate that awaits him and this country. Wilhelm, a military biography. This is his favorite book 300 years from now, an epic poem praising the life of this man. In this book, it is written that he will rule as a terrible emperor and will be killed at a young age. She also featured in the biography. It was said that Wilhelm and she were in love with each other. The Ice Maiden, Lisbeth Farkrantz. It all began when he received a special brooch from her. After a whirlwind romance, they swore eternal love to each other. However, someone came and destroyed their relationship. It was him. Their love was shattered, consumed by grief and despair. She closed her heart again. In the end, the cruel emperor died at her hand. With his death, the Baltic Empire fell apart, and Wilhelm later founded the kingdom of Sauvalier. Wait, that doesn't matter at all. In any case, marrying her is a bad idea. He likes being alive, and he definitely won't interfere in other people's relationships. She called the prince with a calm expression and asked, "He looks rather pale. Is something bothering him?" He said with a confused look that it was not so at all. Maya stood next to him and said that he probably couldn't sleep because of the excitement of the upcoming dinner. She leaned towards him and said that she understood that he was nervous, but the tea would get cold. He asked with a worried look, so he should start a conversation? He thought that he asked his father to help him find a bride. If he ruined the deal, it would be like spitting in the emperor's face. He drank his tea and thought that he would end this meeting peacefully. He called her by name and said that he suspected she was somewhat shocked by the sudden talk of an engagement. Since everyone has their own circumstances, he hoped that it had not caused her any inconvenience. They looked at each other in silence for a few seconds, and Lisbeth said that she was grateful for his thoughtful words. She herself had been surprised when she first heard the news, but it was a great honor for her. MC, looking worried, thought that she was definitely thinking about the wrong thing. He said with a smile that it seemed she did not want an engagement to him. In that case, it would be kind of her to ask her father to refuse this engagement. He thought that for someone like her, who already had Wilhelm, her participation in a marriage of convenience was probably only due to the emperor's orders. Since it was too great an honor for them, she should refuse the offer. He was surprised because she said that it was not so at all. She asked him to ignore it. He thought that this could be the perfect opportunity. Perhaps he had been been a little hasty? He seemed to understand. She probably meant to do better. Even if she wanted to refuse, there must surely be a good reason to do so. He said that he understood her and was glad to hear it. In that case, he should introduce himself first. Plan number 1, 1,000 lies. He said that he, the fourth prince, was called the most gifted genius since the founding of the Baltic Empire. Be it academics, imperial studies, or swordsmanship, no one can compare to his incredible skill. He attracts both men and women. Everyone loves him, regardless of gender. In the Scorpio Palace, he is idolized and praised. He thought with a worried look that this was too blatant a lie. Just such a word made him want to cry. Now, it would not surprise anyone if his pretentiousness led to disappointment and she called off the engagement. Maya, smiling, placed her hands on his shoulders and said that everything was as His Highness said. His Highness dealt with the corruption that was flourishing in their palace and also saved her, who was accused of treason. The prince is truly an incredible person. Rudolph, looking displeased, thought that she should play along with him. He decided to tell the truth, turned around and said that in fact, he needed to tell her something. He decided to switch to the second plan with threats, and said that even though he was fourth in line, he still had a right to the throne. Therefore, there were people who were trying to kill him. In fact, he had recently been poisoned by a maid, after which he fell into a coma. When he woke up, he was almost killed. If she married him, she might get involved in something dangerous. He thought, great. There must be a really good reason to call off the engagement. Lisbeth asked with a calm expression, is that a problem? Her people, Farkrants, have long been called the symbol of the Empire's army. She personally practices spearmanship. To be afraid only because of possible murders would be a shame for her family. He thought that this would not do either. An even more compelling reason for her refusal was needed. He was thinking about this, and she asked if he would share any stories from his childhood. He was a little surprised by this and wondered what she was thinking about. There was not a single event in his childhood worthy of her attention. He reached into his pocket and remembered how, as a child, a girl gave him a coin and said that she was grateful that he saved her there. She gives it to him as her gratitude. He thought that he still keeps the coin he received then. However, there's no need to tell her about it because these memories are only his. She called His Highness. He stopped recalling this and asked, she wants to hear a story from his childhood, right? He thought that many of these stories are notorious among the nobles. Does she want to make him say this to laugh at him? She will surely gossip about it with Wilhelm later. If this is really the case, he does not care. He decided to play her game, got up from his chair and said that then, no matter what, she must enjoy his story. This is a funny, idiotic, and unfortunate comedy of his life. It seems that she already knows, but he is the son of one of the emperor's mistresses, an illegitimate child. In general, he should not have the right to the throne, but his mother desperately begged the emperor to make him the fourth prince and such. Maya, with a slightly worried look, said that it was probably concern for his future. He said that he asked his mother at some point. He came to his mother and asked why he was born. She said it was so she could become part of the imperial family, of course. He was simply insurance for her to continue living a luxurious life in the imperial family, even after she had abandoned him. That was the only reason for his existence. When a new mistress suddenly appeared and started acting like the prince's mother, of course, the nobles and royals weren't thrilled. However, they couldn't publicly denounce the prince's mother, so neither gossip nor violence destroyed him. Being ignored was the most painful. Even if he reached out to them or asked for help, even if he excelled in swordsmanship or studied diligently, his biological father, the emperor, and even his own mother all treated him as if he didn't exist, as if he shouldn't have existed. That's why he did what they couldn't ignore. He broke things on a whim, ordered servants to do the impossible for fun, threw tantrums and cursed people, then punished them for it and laughed at their suffering, showed cruelty at the slightest provocation. And so a tyrant prince was born. He felt happy while he was like this. Everyone paid attention to him. What does she think about this? It's quite funny, isn't it? He wondered, what is he doing? He's just trying to make her hate him. There was no need to be so frank. Maya said loudly that this was too cruel. She can't believe that His Highness was treated like this all this time. He thought that, so she didn't know the whole story. After all, she became a servant only recently. He was about to leave and thought that this was enough. Knowing this, she will see in him a pathetic man whom even his own servants despise. The Ice Maiden would never agree to betroth herself to such a pathetic man. He turned around, looked at Lisbeth, and noticed that she was crying after his story. He was very surprised by this, started looking for a handkerchief in his pocket, and said that he apologized for such a long story. She could use his handkerchief. He took out the handkerchief, but the coin he was holding there fell out and fell to the ground with a loud clink. He very quickly picked up the coin, put it in his pocket, and gave her his handkerchief. She called him and was going to ask something about the coin. He turned away and said that it was none of her business. She wiped the tears from her face, and Maya said with a smile that it was time to sum things up. They began to leave together, and she quietly told His Majesty that now was the right moment to take her hand. He walked ahead, looked at her with a slightly worried look, and wondered, I wonder why she was crying just now? She found it so funny that tears came to her eyes. What was she thinking about now? They arrived at the carriage, and the protagonist said he was very grateful for their time spent today. Regarding the engagement, It seemed best if she sent a letter with a reply as soon as she found time to think about it. Lisbeth stood in front of him and asked, "A letter?" He agreed, and said that he was asking her to take her time and think everything over carefully. He thought it would be easier for her to refuse in person, and that would help avoid confrontations. She considered this for a few seconds and said that it was unnecessary because she agreed to marry him. He was shocked by this, and she said that despite her inexperience, she asked for his understanding and support. He was still shocked by this, and Maya grabbed his shoulder and told His Majesty that he had done it. He stood to the side with a shocked expression on his face and wondered how it had come to this. At this rate, he would definitely be killed. Lisbeth called her name with a sly grin and said that she did a good job. She should continue to watch over him. She stood next to him and with a small smile respectfully said that her wish was the command. After a while, MC thought that 3 days had passed since he became engaged to the Ice Maiden, Lisbeth, who would kill him in the future. He would not let her kill him this time. He did not know what she really thought of him, so the best option would be to keep his distance from her so that she would not get angry, or so he thought. She was currently bandaging his wounds, and he wondered how this could happen. She handed him a spoon with food and said that she was finished bandaging his wounds. There were medicinal herbs in this soup that would speed up his recovery. He looked at her with a worried look and wondered why she was in his room. He said loudly that she did not have to feed him. He felt sorry for bothering her. He was actually quite a clumsy person. He fell down the stairs. It didn't matter, really, it happened all the time. She sat in front of him silently, but at that moment someone knocked on the door. Maya entered the room and asked, "He had a meeting with the Emperor today, right? He didn't accidentally trip on the stairs in the palace?" She put the cup on the table, and he called her by name. Lisbeth asked, "He said he fell down the stairs, but he lied, didn't he? Those wounds were inflicted on him by someone. It was an attack. He just went to see the Emperor. Then, why was he hurt so badly? Who was it, and why did he do it? Who attacked him like that?" He was worried because she leaned close to him and thought that these wounds were really not serious. He remembered how earlier he came to the palace, where 2 guys attacked him. One of them grabbed him by the collar and Rudolph asked what they were doing. The guy who grabbed him said loudly that he knew it perfectly well. He was walking here right in front of Sir Robin, the 3rd prince. He looked at him with a displeased expression and thought that this was simply terrible. The prince stood nearby and loudly said that he was accused of desecrating his eyes. They must put this pig in his place. They started kicking him, and he thought that the 3rd prince constantly made a punching bag out of him every time he saw him. He had been experiencing this since childhood. Accusing the royal family is usually a serious crime punishable by death. The prince asked loudly with an evil grin. Now does he understand? No one will save him in this palace. The protagonist thought that the Baldic Empire palace was divided into 3 parts. His brothers lived in separate parts, each of which was their property. This is what would happen to him if he left his Scorpio palace. The guy lifted him up with one hand and asked, did he understand his place? He spat in his face with a sly grin, which made him very angry. He began to hit him harder, and Robin said that he should at least leave his face. At this point, he thought that he didn't want Lisbeth to know about this anymore. He refused and said that this was not what happened. He asked her not to worry. She calmed down a little and asked, is that really true? He looked at her and thought that she would become his enemy, hunting for his life. He couldn't open up to her. Maya called her and said that in fact, the prince was trying to convey to her that he dealt with the villains who dared to oppose him. These were honorable wounds, so she shouldn't worry. He got indignant about this, called her name loudly, and asked what she was talking about. Besides, what kind of idea is this about him? She asked joyfully. What is he talking about? After all, he was the one who caught Tapple red-handed. He will never give up without a fight. She is sure that he had some kind of plan. He thought that he knew that she was right. Earlier, the guy finished beating him, insulted him, and asked if he learned his lesson. Robin said that they ended up wasting a lot of time on him. It was time to go. When they walked a few meters away, MC stood up and said that in this case, he would be late for the meeting with his father. They were very surprised by what they heard and asked what he just said. A man was walking towards them, who called them all and asked what all this even meant. The 3rd prince and his friends turned to him and loudly asked, is this the head butler? What are the emperor's servants doing here? They were about to say something else, and he approached the 4th prince and asked if he was okay. He called Prince Robin and said that he couldn't escape from something like this. They wounded the 4th prince's face, and with it, His Majesty's reputation. He was very surprised by this and said loudly that it was a quarrel between brothers. Doesn't this happen from time to time? The butler left and said that he would listen to his excuses later. They need to hurry, because the emperor is waiting for him. He became very angry when he noticed that Rudolph turned to him with a sly grin. He walked down the corridor and thought that it was worth manipulating them so that they would hit him in the face and drag out the fight. He knew that the head butler would come if there was a delay in the reception with the emperor. Now he had changed. With his knowledge of the future, He would live with the experience of his past life to the very end. At the moment, he thought that he didn't care about Robin. Right now, he needed to understand what Lisbeth was thinking. They were sitting opposite each other, and he became very worried when he noticed her small smile. She came closer, leaned toward him, and asked, "So, how was the meeting with the Emperor? Did he say something about their engagement?" He again remembered what had happened earlier. He came to the Emperor, knelt down, and told his father that he apologized for being late. He sat on the throne and said that everything was fine. Apparently, he had handled the engagement well. His mother was sitting on his lap and told His Highness that he should leave him and have fun with her a little longer. He looked at Beatrice with a smile and said, "What a pity. She is such a hopeless woman." The protagonist stood up and said that he was grateful for his help with the engagement. The Emperor looked at him and asked, "Is he still here?" He said with a serious expression that he could go. From now on, he should know his place. Currently, he was sitting in his room and said that everything had gone as usual. Lisbeth looked at him with a worried look and said that she understood him. He noticed this and said loudly that in any case, he was pleasantly surprised when he returned and saw her here. Why did she come here? Lisbeth said with a serious expression that she had come to visit him. He began to feel embarrassed about this, and she asked if it was strange to worry about how her fiancé was doing. He denied it and thought that she should stop saying things that made his heart beat faster. She sat in front of him and asked, however, does he still often get hurt like this? She is very worried as his fiancé. From now on, she will come to his room every day. He was very surprised by this and said with a slightly nervous look that it seemed like every day somehow. He didn't have time to finish because Maya said that she was also worried about him as his maid. Lisbeth said with a smile that it was decided. Then from now on, she would visit him every day. Sometime later in the Farkrantz mansion. At night, she sat in her office, thanked Maya and said that thanks to her as his personal maid, she was able to get closer to him. She asks her to continue to watch him. She said with a respectful tone that she would do as she wished. She sat at her desk, with an embarrassed expression on her face, thinking about him, and said that his beautiful, dignified figure, his amber eyes and gentle voice melted the soul and body. Her nose started bleeding, and Maya called her and said that it was written all over her face. She should be patient a little longer. If she loved him so much, then why not behave more warmly with him? She thought the prince was confused. Lisbeth was very worried about this and asked if she was really that unfriendly. She said with a small smile that she was just like a stone. She reminded her about every time and said that her expressions and words were icy, which was really off-putting. She said loudly, with an embarrassed expression, that she couldn't help it. She had been in love with him for a long time. She was so nervous around him that her head went blank. Every time she tried to start a conversation with him, her face tensed up. Maya looked at her and said that she looked so confident on the outside, but so modest on the inside. She couldn't believe that she decided to visit him every day. She thought she did the right thing by plucking up the courage to say it, but she was worried about how it would all end. Lisbeth picked up her spear that was hanging on the wall, called her, and said that she didn't need courage to visit him. In the end, she won't be able to ask for any of this. She can't believe he was treated so horribly. She will never forgive those who hurt him or herself for living without knowing it. She will protect him and turn those idiots into rust on this spear. She called her with a confused look and said that most likely Prince Rudolph was injured by the third prince this time, and he will not come to the Scorpio Palace. This incident was an exception, so she must put this dangerous thing back. She was very surprised by what she heard, and Maya said with a serious look that after the incident with Tapel, no one in the palace disrespected His Majesty anymore. Such people were destroyed by the fourth prince's personal servant, that is her. Lisbeth was touched by her words, but still grabbed her and asked, "What is this smug face?" She became worried about this, called her loudly and said that she was in pain. She looked at her with a displeased look and thought that she also wanted to become close to the prince. She had an idea. She let her go and asked if this meant that the reason she would visit the prince every day. She agreed with a smile and said that it was not to guard him, but to go on a date with him. She started to run away and said loudly that she could not do this. Maya grabbed her and said loudly that she could. She must get used to talking to His Highness as soon as possible. That day is approaching. Lisbeth calmed down, agreed, and said that her birthday would be in a week. Her nose started bleeding, and she said with an embarrassed expression that she would dance with the prince and faint from joy and nerves. She understands everything and will solve this. Maya used a painful hold with a smile and said that besides, this was payback for her past actions. She looked at her with a displeased expression and loudly asked, "Come to that, is she her master, or has she forgotten about it?" At the same time, MC lay on the bed and wondered if she really was the same Ice Maiden who was in Wilhelm's biography. Something is clearly wrong. She is definitely cold, but it seems she was dating him not only out of a sense of duty. The fall of Tapel and his search for a bride, this was definitely not in that future story. Does the future change because of his actions? It seems to him that this is not entirely true. Even if he tries to avoid her, she will pursue him herself. Could it be that he's heading towards the timeline when he marries her? It's a wild guess, but if marrying Lisbeth is an inevitable event, then is his death also an inevitable event? At the same time, Wilhelm von Sauvelier was sitting on the balcony with a glass of wine and said that Lisbeth's birthday was coming soon and he would come to pick her up. He would definitely make her his. The protagonist, forgetting about his tea, sat and thought about something of his own. Lisbeth looked at him silently, not disturbing him. He wondered if he could survive this. At that moment, Maya suddenly called out to him. He jumped in surprise and asked her what was going on. The maid indignantly asked him if he'd even been listening. Lisbeth herself couldn't help but tell him about it. When the protagonist learned what Maya meant, he exclaimed in surprise, "Lisbeth's birthday party?" A little later, when she left, he told the maid he wasn't going. Maya put her hand on her chest and said, "This is his fiancée's party after all. It's considered impolite to come with a woman from outside his family." The protagonist sighed heavily and said, "Yes, that made sense." He'd hoped Maya would join him, but if it wasn't proper, then so be it. MC got up from the table and told the maid he wanted her to prepare something for him in advance. The girl eagerly asked what it was. He whispered something in her ear, and the maid blushed with joy and exclaimed, "Let him leave it to her. She would definitely bring him what he wanted." The protagonist said he was counting on her. He thought, on the day of Lisbeth's party, he would have to charm her with everything he had. A week later, the protagonist attended his fiancée's party. He was greeted by the girl's mother, Miss Teresa Farkrantz, and her father, Marquise Douglas Farkrantz. Teresa greeted Rudolph with a sweet smile, but Douglas looked at him sternly and said nothing. The protagonist thanked them for the invitation and thought, "The Marquise's face is so scary." Teresa went with MC to escort him to Lisbeth. She knocked on her daughter's door and informed her that the prince was here. The protagonist thought excitedly, "Great, he's ready. The moment he sees her, he'll tell her everything he's wanted." When he and Therese entered her room, he was simply stunned with amazement, all the words instantly flying out of his head. Lisbeth, in an evening gown with a beautiful hairstyle, was simply magnificent. She bowed to him and thanked him for coming today. The protagonist stuttered, thanking her for the invitation. Therese giggled knowingly and, as she left, told them there was still plenty of time before the party. Please make them feel at home. When Lisbeth and Rodolfo were alone, he wondered in confusion. What should he say to her? All the topics he had prepared flew out of his head. They both wanted to say something at once, and both immediately fell silent. Rodolfo exclaimed, "Let her speak first." The girl objected, "No, what is he talking about? Let him speak first." The protagonist took a bold step and, looking Lisbeth in the eye, said, "She looked simply enchanting today." The girl looked at him in surprise, then blushed and replied that she was very glad to hear that. She added that he, too, was very elegant. Lisbeth covered her face with her hands to hide the telltale blush on her cheeks. The protagonist wondered in surprise, was she really the Ice Maiden, Lisbeth? She was so different from the heroine from the biography. At that moment, footsteps were heard in the hallway. The MC ignored them and remarked, "Shouldn't she be in love with Wilhelm?" The man in question, meanwhile, was already approaching the girl's room. The protagonist reached into the lapel of his jacket and told her that he had actually brought something for her. Lisbeth froze in anticipation, and at that moment, the door swung open, and Wilhelm appeared on the threshold. He leaned theatrically against the doorframe and greeted the girl, noting that she looked even more beautiful today than usual. Lisbeth looked at him in surprise. The protagonist didn't intervene in their conversation. The guy continued. He'd been worried since he'd stopped hearing about her lately. He was glad she was doing well. After all, they were destined to be together. MC thought in amazement. Wilhelm. It was the protagonist, Wilhelm, a military biography revered by generations to come, and Lisbeth. The guy pretended he'd just noticed the protagonist and casually said, "Oh, she has guests. Let her forgive him." He approached Rudolph, pinned him against the wall, and in a foreboding tone asked him if he didn't understand what was going on. He didn't know who he was, but he'd better get out of his way. MC thought, as he'd suspected, he and Lisbeth were in love. In the end, he simply succumbed to her influence. What a clown he was. At that moment, Lisbeth approached them and abruptly removed Wilhelm's hand from the wall. He addressed her by name in surprise. The girl furiously told him not to dare touch Prince Rudolph. They stared at her in amazement. Lisbeth, breathing heavily with indignation, asked him in an icy tone if they were destined to be together. He shouldn't make her laugh. He was the one who desecrated her precious memories. He was simply a deceiver. Let him leave her fiancé, Wilhelm exclaimed in surprise. Fiancé? What was she even talking about? The girl smirked, walked closer to the protagonist, and said, "It seems he doesn't know. She's engaged to the prince." The young man simply turned black with anger and glared at the protagonist. MC wondered, perplexed. What was going on? She wasn't in love with Wilhelm. In fact, she hated him. This didn't sound like a lover's quarrel. What had happened between them? Had he desecrated her precious memories? The precious memories he'd mentioned, they were also from the biography. Memories from when she was still a child. Rudolph had hurt her very badly back then, and Rudolph had come to her aid. He'd pulled the offender aside, given him a beating, and returned to her, telling her that everything was fine now. Lisbeth thanked him, and when Wilhelm was about to leave, she stopped him, gave him a brooch, and promised to meet again. As a result, they were reunited again, almost 10 years later. This arc was one of the most beloved in the biography among women. As he thought about it now, he remembered that he hadn't done anything like that. He hadn't even been a tyrant 10 years ago. Historians had probably dramatized everything after that incident. Lisbeth irritably asked the boy if he remembered what she'd asked him about in the letter earlier. What had she given him the day they met? Wilhelm exclaimed. Of course he remembers. She'd given him this brooch. With these words, he showed it to her. Lisbeth cried out emotionally. It wasn't a brooch. The protagonist looked at the whole situation in bewilderment. The boy's face took on a puzzled expression, and he said, That's impossible. She definitely gave him this brooch. The girl interrupted him and angrily exclaimed, She doesn't want to listen to his excuses anymore. He deceived her and let him never set foot in her presence again. Wilhelm, astonished, turned to leave and said, No, he's leaving today. Lisbeth watched him go silently. The protagonist thought in surprise. He didn't understand. This is too different from the history he knew. His actions had rewritten it, but his actions weren't supposed to affect the past. So the story about the brooch was invented by historians? They apparently exaggerated their relationship for greater sensationalism. To this end, they even claimed that he, Rudolf, had treated Lisbeth rudely in the past. According to the story, Wilhelm is pursuing Lisbeth, but she introduced him, the protagonist, as her fiancé. And now, for Wilhelm, he's the guy who stole his bride, just like in the story he knew. Even if he hadn't become emperor, in that case, this guy could kill him, since he hates him. Rudolf thought about Wilhelm. It was too dangerous to leave her alone now. It wasn't too late. He had to end the engagement. The protagonist turned to the girl and asked, apologizing for the question, what kind of relationship they had with this guy. Lisbeth turned to him, tears streaming down her face. She sheepishly apologized to him for the inconvenience. He, not expecting to see her in tears, said it was nothing. She apologized again, adding that it was only natural for him to be worried. The girl said, That man, and fell silent. The protagonist, looking at her, thought, Come on, he needs to tell her that he and Wilhelm have come a long way, haven't they? And he, Rudolf, is breaking off their engagement. He needs to say it. The protagonist addressed her by name, took her by the shoulders, and instead of what he wanted, told her to tell him everything. The girl looked at him in amazement. The MC continued, Judging by her behavior, it didn't look like she was being pursued by her ex-lover. He wanted her to tell him more. What happened between her and that man? Lisbeth looked at him, confused and surprised at the same time. The protagonist wondered, why is he saying such a thing? He already knew the answer, because the expression on her face reminded him of his as a child. Anxiety, worry, fear. She wanted to share her story, but she was afraid he, Rudolf, would be disappointed in her, and she realized it wouldn't be in vain. That look of despair on her face spoke volumes. Suddenly, Lisbeth called him by name and fell against his chest. MC thought in confusion. He hadn't meant for her to have that expression. He'd just had an idea. At that moment, she spoke up. He really hadn't changed at all. They sat down on the floor, and Lisbeth asked him if he could then listen to her story, her precious memories, desecrated by this man. The girl began to share her story about those memories that Wilhelm had desecrated. It had happened 9 years ago, when she was 5 years old. Her father took her to the imperial palace, and she happily went with him. On the way there, she admired everything she saw along the way. The beautiful flowers, the wonderful scenery. Her father told her that if she ran too fast, she would fall. As soon as he said these words, she stumbled and fell. Her father jumped to her and cried out anxiously, Is she okay? The girl answered that she was fine. After all, she had an amulet, a gift from her father. Her father picked her up, held her close, and smiled at her, telling her how good she was. Lisbeth noticed that the first Farkrantz carried a certain amulet with him throughout his military exploits. It was a family tradition to keep one of these close at hand. As long as the amulet was with a person, their wishes would come true. Her father told her then to take care of it. She promised him this. When they arrived at the palace, her father left her in one of the rooms, telling her that he had an important conversation and that she should stay there and read a book until he returned. While her father was having his conversation with the emperor, she was bored. Unnoticed by the men, she went out into the corridor and wondered where the garden was. She wandered around the palace looking for the garden, got lost, and began to panic. Where was she? At that moment, she met a boy with a guard in the hall. It was Robin. He told her, but he didn't see her there. She knows this is the imperial palace, right? He added ominously, all uninvited guests are sentenced to death. Lisbeth simply shook with fear. One of his attendants leaned over to him and asked, What is he doing? Let him look at her. She was probably their guest's daughter. Robin shouted at him to shut up. He was actually looking for someone to test the fencing skills he'd acquired yesterday on. He ordered his attendants to catch Lisbeth. She became frightened and ran away from them. Robin shouted to his entourage to stop. Let them catch her quickly. They didn't want to be targets along with her, did they? Stop wasting time. Let them seize her. Lisbeth thought, terrified. Why are they chasing her? If only someone would help her. She turned into one of the corridors, and at that moment someone grabbed her by the arm and pulled her into a room, telling her that it would be safe here. Robin and his servants ran past, the prince angrily shouting, Where did she go? If they lost her, they would be his carriage for the rest of the week. The servants answered that they understood him. They thought the girl had run in that direction. As the prince and his servants ran past, she asked the boy in surprise who he was. In response, he put his finger to his lips and told her to be quiet. He asked her, were those guys chasing her? But she shouldn't worry. No one would come in here. She would be safe. He approached the door, cautiously peered into the corridor, and noticed that no one was there. The boy asked her where she wanted to go. She told him that she actually wanted to go to the garden. When he led her where she wanted, Lisbeth couldn't contain her admiring cry. The garden was so beautiful. She asked him if she could take a few flowers from here. He said, of course, and helped her assemble a bouquet. She wove a wreath of flowers and, laughing, placed it on his head. At that moment, the voices of Robin and his servants were heard. The boy quickly and unceremoniously pushed her behind a bush and told her to be quiet and not come out. He barely managed to hide her when the prince appeared before him, riding, as if on a horse, on the back of one of the servants. He saw the boy and grumbled, and he had been wondering who it could be. You think someone like him is allowed into this garden? The boy looked at him silently. Robin said, well, he's kind. He allows him to be here. Then he addressed him insultingly and asked him if he had seen a girl about his age here. The boy replied that he hadn't seen anyone. The second servant removed him from his colleague's back. Robin handed him over. Oh well, he understood everything. Suddenly, he jumped up to her savior, hit him hard and exclaimed, did he think he would say that? Something was wrong with him. A moron like him would lie very easily, after all. The boy wiped the blood from his face, and the prince ordered his servants to hold him quickly. They tried to reason with Robin, but he growled at them so much that one of the servants grabbed the boy in his arms. The prince began to beat him. Let him talk already. He would stop beating him only when he told him where she was. Lisbeth was sitting behind a bush and crying. Finally, one of the servants noticed that the noon bell was ringing. It was time for him, His Highness, to have dinner. Robin stopped hitting the boy and told his minions that they were leaving. The man carefully placed the poor guy on the ground, and they left. Lisbeth peeked out from behind a bush and asked him if he was okay. The boy stood up, cleared his throat, and told her that he was fine. He was used to it, so everything was fine. He apologized for pushing her and asked if she was okay, if she was hurt. Lisbeth sobbed, and he asked her in surprise what was wrong with her. Why was she crying? The girl burst into tears and said, anyone would cry. Hearing that he was used to being hit was simply terrible. He said in a dejected voice, of course. After a short silence, the boy ruffled his hair and said with a smile, he never thought anyone would cry because of him. This was the first time something like this had ever happened to him. Lisbeth calmed down a little and smiled timidly at him too. She told him that for saving her, she would give him this. Lisbeth extended her hand to him, and in her palm lay a gold coin. He asked her if she was sure about this. The coin was very beautiful. Lisbeth answered that her father had said that all a person's wishes would come true if they had this coin. The boy took the coin from her palm and thanked her. He added that if she really did grant wishes, then one of his had already been fulfilled. Lisbeth asked him what his wish was. The boy laughed sheepishly and said, well, she noticed him. Lisbeth continued, and after that, a servant found them, and the boy ran away and disappeared. She was taken from the garden without the opportunity to ask his name. The protagonist listened to her and couldn't believe it. It simply couldn't be true. It couldn't be true. The girl he met in the Imperial Palace 9 years ago, the one who gave him this amulet in the form of a gold coin, couldn't be Lisbeth. In 10 years, she would become an ice maiden and kill him. Lisbeth continued her story, after which her father sternly scolded her, and she was again given the exact same gold coin she had given to the boy. She showed him the amulet and said, this is a gold coin. The girl turned to him and asked him, he has one too, right? The surprised protagonist took out of his pocket what she had given him 9 years ago and showed it to her. She smiled joyfully through her tears. MC felt tears well up in his eyes too. He looked at Lisbeth and thought, during the struggle, during the difficulties, during the pain, during the times when he felt like he could break, the amulet saved him. And now he embraced Lisbeth and told her that thanks to this coin, thanks to his memories of her, he could remain himself. He thanked her for saving him and for paying attention to him. Lisbeth, hugging him tightly, exclaimed, yes, it's true. She had always wanted to express her gratitude to him. They remained in this embrace for a moment longer, savoring their togetherness. Then he pulled away and said, I think it's time. Lisbeth gasped in confusion. She had completely forgotten about her birthday party. She stood up, brushed the hem of her dress, and called him to follow her. The protagonist asked her to stop. He asked her again, so that man Wilhelm, what is their relationship like? Lisbeth was embarrassed, lowered her head and said irritably, he's proof of her stupidity. Rodolfo, confused, addressed her by name. What did she mean by that? The girl remained silent. MC thought, why this man? He couldn't be mistaken. In that case, Lisbeth will marry Rudolf. No, that's even good. After all, Rudolf will die at her hands. That's how it will be. He, Prince Rudolf, has no future. Lisbeth finally spoke up. She'll tell him everything. She'd foolishly met Wilhelm at a party organized about a year ago. When it was time for entertainment, the guests asked her to dance with them, to sing for them. One nobleman asked her to dance with his son, but she rudely told them all to get out of her sight. By this time, her patience was wearing thin. She couldn't hire a spy or investigator until she came of age. And before she knew it, 8 years had passed, and she still hadn't met him, the Rudolph of her memories. Then Wilhelm approached her and told her he'd found her. He added, "Finally, they've met. She's his soulmate," and handed her a flower. She apologized and asked him who he was. She wasn't particularly attracted to superficial men who reeked of lies. Wilhelm chuckled, noticing that it was cruel. He asked her if she'd forgotten. 8 years ago on that day, in the Imperial Palace, where the white jasmine bloomed so beautifully, they'd shared a moment of bliss. Lisbeth, unable to believe her ears and eyes, cried out, "This can't be!" But his hair was a different color from theirs. He exclaimed in surprise, "Oh, a different color? In fact, he's the only one with a hair color different from his family's." He then added that this had sparked a lot of rumors. That's why he dyed his hair red, so they could finally calm down. Lisbeth asked him, "What's his real hair color?" He replied, "The same as the day they met," and he repeated himself again. "Finally they've met. She's his soulmate." Lisbeth paused briefly, and then continued. Her desire to meet him, Rudolph, was so strong that it clouded her judgment, so she began to blindly trust Wilhelm. From that day on, she saw him regularly, only once a month for tea, of course, but still. The protagonist thought at that moment, "I'm not sure, but Wilhelm is really starting to irritate me." The girl noticed his distorted face and exclaimed in fear. Just as she thought, he was probably disappointed in her. She was really so foolish as to blindly trust a liar like him. The protagonist objected in amazement. That's not true at all. She misunderstood him. He wasn't angry with her. He thought, this is complete nonsense. How could Wilhelm tell her the story of their meeting? Lisbeth said regretfully, even though his eye color was the same, his hair color, texture, gaze, and even the shape of his mouth were completely different. And yet, she believed him. If she could go back in time, she would tear her past self to pieces with her own spear. MC, fearing for her well-being, said with a smile, "It's okay. Let her calm down." So let her continue her story. The girl immediately regained control of her emotions and sheepishly apologized to him for this. She added that she had foolishly trusted Wilhelm back then. However, the more she talked to him, the more she felt something was wrong. And then she asked him. The protagonist, guessing, asked, "The thing she gave him that day?" Lisbeth answered, "Absolutely right. The one she gave him at their first meeting. Or perhaps he didn't value it enough to always carry it with him?" The boy remained silent. She looked at him carefully and called out his name. Did he hear her? He seemed to catch himself and apologized. He added that it was the other way around. These memories were too dear to him, so he kept them in a safe place to ensure they were undamaged. The girl said thoughtfully, "I see." Since then, she asked him about it several times, but he always dodged the question, and her doubts grew gradually. One day, Maya asked her if he was really the boy from her memories. She knew many years had passed, but he still seemed completely different from what she'd told her. Lisbeth agreed, though to be honest, even she couldn't be sure. Maya suggested that if Wilhelm was lying, the real boy from her memories must still be out there somewhere. If she could infiltrate the palace where they met, she might find a clue. Lisbeth exclaimed, "What an idea! Infiltrate the palace. Could she ask her to do that?" Maya happily answered, "Of course. She would complete the mission." At that moment, the astonished protagonist cried out for her to stop her story for a minute. He asked her in surprise, "So Maya was her agent?" Lisbeth was embarrassed, realizing she'd let herself in. The girl sheepishly apologized to him for that. He told her it was fine. He wasn't angry, he was just surprised. MC asked her if Maya was the only one she'd told about their meeting. The girl replied that it was. The protagonist asked if anyone else could have heard about it. Lisbeth said in surprise, "That's impossible. Maya had been her servant and bodyguard since childhood. If a rat had appeared, she would have definitely sensed it." The protagonist thought, Maya seems more capable than he expected. However, if only she knew about this, how did Wilhelm know about their past? Of course, he hadn't told anyone either. Rudolph suggested the girl resume their story. She continued, "And after infiltrating the palace, Maya saw him staring at the coin, and she began to suspect that Prince Rudolph might be the boy from her memories. Then, at the meeting, she confirmed that he was indeed the one she remembered. The protagonist noticed a gold coin. He tried to hide it, but he thought she'd seen it. The girl smiled and said, so she immediately agreed to the engagement. MC said it was a pretty quick decision. Lisbeth mentioned Wilhelm. She asked Maya to deliver a letter to sever ties with him. When he read the letter, he exclaimed, "What does that even mean?" Then she confirmed it again. She told him, as the letter said, Lisbeth would no longer see him. Wilhelm remarked, "What a sudden decision." He couldn't believe it. Maya then asked him to answer her question. What did her mistress give him that day? He was embarrassed. He clearly hadn't expected it, and irritably replied that she'd given him a brooch. Maya smiled at him and said, now she understood everything. Lisbeth took a deep breath and said, and so it was confirmed that this man had deceived her. The protagonist was still tormented by the question, why did Wilhelm know anything about what happened? What if he had also been at the palace that day and seen them playing in the garden? He could see that she had given him something, but not enough to see what it was. So he always avoided the question, and at the last moment, out of desperation, he answered that it was a brooch. There were other things that troubled him, but for now, it no longer seemed meaningless. More importantly, why had he done it? He suspected the answer lay in something deeper. The Marquis Farkrant's family was a force of military might. For aristocrats and royals who wished to dominate the empire, their power was something to covet above all else. Marrying Lisbeth would mean receiving the support of the Farkrant's family. In fact, in the biography, after the death of the terrible Emperor Rudolf, supported by the Marquis family, Wilhelm destroyed the empire and created a new kingdom. Could it be that Wilhelm's plan also included murdering Rudolph at Lisbeth's hands? The girl was still grieving. He was probably disappointed in such a foolish girl like her. The protagonist indignantly addressed her by name and exclaimed that he was not disappointed. That man had used her and trampled on their memories. It was his fault. She wanted to say something to him, but he advised her to forget that idiot, because today was her birthday. When they appeared in the common room, everyone looked at them in bewilderment. The guests began to chatter. Lisbeth was beautiful as always, but why was a tyrant prince next to her? Why was she with someone like him? He was a real tyrant. That prince. Rudolph thought that his engagement to Lisbeth hadn't been announced yet. He didn't know why, but it was the emperor's decision. Lisbeth turned to him and said she needed to meet her guests. He smiled and remarked, well, they'd see each other later. The protagonist thought it best not to start rumors, so he'd remain a fly on the wall. Meanwhile, Lisbeth greeted all the guests, irritably waving away annoying admirers. Then the music started playing, and everyone started dancing. The protagonist thought, dance. He was always alone at such parties, so this was the first time he'd really paid attention to it. The only dances he knew were at village festivals 300 years ago. The instruments and tempo were completely different, so his knowledge was useless. If someone had asked him to dance, he would have come up with a good reason to refuse. But this song that was playing now, it was so enticing. At that moment, Lisbeth approached him and asked him if he would ask her to dance. He became embarrassed and reluctantly admitted to her that in fact, he'd never danced. The girl smiled. So that's what he's worried about? Then let her be his first partner. MC looked at her with alarm. Lisbeth said, don't worry, she'll show him what to do. Let him simply follow her, not slouch. Stand up straight, listen to the music and follow the rhythm. The guests, watching them, chuckled. What kind of childish dance was this? One of the aristocrats was indignant. Why was this lady dancing with this tyrant prince? Suddenly, a cheerful idea occurred to him. The aristocrat grabbed his wife, who was standing nearby, and led her in the dance. Approaching the couple, Lisbeth and Rodolfo, he pushed the protagonist so hard that he fell. The aristocrat feigned a groan. May he forgive him for his clumsiness. Leaving the dance floor, the aristocrat apologized to the protagonist once again and winked conspiratorially at his wife. All the guests began to mock the MC. People like him were unworthy of being with Lisbeth. He can't even dance properly. He looks like a disgusting pig. The protagonist was ready to sink into the ground with shame. But Lisbeth approached him and, smiling, invited him to try again. He agreed, but wondered if he could really be with her like this. She was a first-class flower, and he was an outcast in the palace. No matter how far he went, this reality would never change. The guests continued to mock him. Let everyone just look at this. He didn't know anything about it. Was he serious? The protagonist's gaze shifted from the guests to Lisbeth's father, Douglas, who looked at him disapprovingly. MC noted that the Marquis clearly didn't like him. Lady Teresa accepted him, but who knows what she was really thinking. Teresa, meanwhile, asked her husband if Rodolfo had no experience dancing. Douglas answered her. Apparently so. The protagonist didn't know where to look. Lisbeth addressed him, but he didn't hear her. He thought, is he destined to be emperor, like in history? The girl addressed him louder, smiling as she remarked that when he danced, he should look at his partner's face, not around him. The protagonist looked at her in surprise and apologized. Lisbeth patiently and gently suggested he try again. Taking her hand, they began dancing again. He said she always looked at him. The girl replied that she shouldn't turn away from him. The protagonist, determined, grabbed the girl more comfortably, supporting her, and led her in the dance. She gasped in amazement, and she wasn't the only one. The guests were also perplexed. Had they started to get into rhythm? Did he really dance that well? It must have been pure chance. Douglas thought in bewilderment. It's very difficult for beginners to synchronize their breathing in dance. Therefore, the main rule for an experienced person is to stay in rhythm and hold your breath. But Prince Rudolph had just synchronized his breathing. How was that possible? The nobleman's wife remarked that she thought Rudolph was a bit cool. The nobleman looked at her in bewilderment. The protagonist and Lisbeth, meanwhile, seemed to have merged into one, twirling in a dance that took everyone's breath away with their grace and elegance. After the dance, they bowed to everyone present. When the protagonist sat down on a chair to catch his breath, he thought he'd managed to finish the dance without stepping on Lisbeth's foot. He hadn't embarrassed her at all, or so he thought. Lisbeth approached him and exclaimed in utter admiration. He was simply magnificent. She couldn't even imagine it was his first dance. The MC thanked her, adding that it was all thanks to her guidance. She exclaimed, he must be tired. She'll bring him something refreshing to drink. After the girl left, he thought with a smile, a memory of a village festive dance. He thought it would be useless, but after calming down and thinking about it, he realized that although the instruments and tempo were different, the rhythm and steps were somewhat similar. Perhaps the noble dance of that era had changed over 300 years and transformed into the dance of commoners at village festivals. Thanks to this, he was able to dance with dignity. He took a deep breath and thought, he can do it. Even if history tells of his death as a terrible emperor, he will rewrite it into a small happy story in which he will forever be with Lisbeth. At that moment, Douglas approached him and asked if he could talk to him for a moment. The protagonist nearly went crazy with panic. The man said he was unable to greet him properly, so he apologized. The protagonist still couldn't believe it, but Marquise Douglas, Lisbeth's father, approached him. He sheepishly replied, no, he should apologize to him. Did something happen? Meanwhile, Lisbeth was in a euphoric state. She was shocked to see Prince Rudolph's serious expression mid-dance. She felt like she could get lost in those amber eyes. Suddenly, the girl came to her senses and grabbed the glass of drink. Approaching the protagonist, she exclaimed, he must be tired, let him take this fruit water. At that moment, Douglas asked the protagonist if he hadn't heard him. He told him that he wanted to have a competition with him. Lisbeth looked at her father in surprise. MC was just as surprised as she was. She wondered, what is he saying? What does he mean by competition? After a while, they gathered on the training ground. Douglas said that even though it was a fight, it was still training. He gave the protagonist a weapon and told him to use this wooden sword. Rudolph examined the weapon in surprise, thinking it was his first time holding it. The sword felt heavier than he'd thought. Douglas, observing it, asked if something was wrong. The protagonist replied that everything was fine, but his, the Marquise's, weapon looked rather worn. Douglas looked at him with irritation, assumed a fighting stance, and exclaimed, that's right, because he's been training since childhood, practicing 1,000 swings a day. That's the norm for him. The protagonist was very surprised by this statement. Teresa and Lisbeth stood to the side, the girl looking at her betrothed with compassion in her eyes. Rudolph noticed, from that terrifying aura, that Lisbeth's father definitely didn't approve of their engagement. Most likely, the Emperor Rudolph's father had really infuriated him. He told Douglas that his son needed a wife. He had a daughter, the same age as his son. Let her be his wife. Douglas was indignant. Give this tyrant prince his Lisbeth? No way. He wouldn't let it go that easily. If an accident happens during training, no one will blame him for the death. The protagonist chuckled. It was possible. At that moment, a worried Lisbeth stepped between them. She turned to the protagonist and begged him not to do this. Her father was known as the Empire's strongest warrior, known as the Obsidian Demon Douglas. Those who challenged him were left in pieces. The protagonist was furious. Were they mocking him? Frankly, he was scared, but he couldn't run. Douglas told his daughter to step back. The girl resisted. Teresa approached her and said her name in a soft voice. Lisbeth, almost in tears, addressed her. Eventually, Teresa helped the protagonist remove his vest, while Lisbeth held his weapon in her hands. Douglas declared, one strike. If he hit him with his sword even once, victory would be his. Did he agree to this? Rudolph wondered if he was implying that someone like him would have trouble even hitting him. He told the man that he hoped he understood, and yet he couldn't run away. Teresa waved her hand and urged them to begin the battle. The protagonist rushed at Douglas with an attack. He thought no one had ever taught him how to wield a sword, but he'd spied on knights training and copied everything they did. It was just imitation, but he simply had to do it. When he approached Lisbeth's father, the man simply blocked his blow and stepped aside. MC rushed past him, even dropping his weapon. He wondered in confusion what had happened. He hadn't seen anything. Douglas pointed his weapon at him and said, continue. The protagonist grabbed his sword and was about to strike Douglas in a jump. The Marquise deftly parried his attack again, pushing him back so hard that Rudolph flew back and fell again. The man uttered another single word, next. But before the protagonist could rise, Douglas jabbed him in the chest with his weapon so hard that MC cried out in surprise and pain and collapsed to the ground again, as if he'd been mown down. Douglas kept saying, next, next, over and over again. Finally, Lisbeth cried out, enough, enough. The man struck the protagonist in a circular motion. Rudolph, lying on the ground before Douglas, thought, this is the difference between him, a prince from the palace, and an obsidian demon who'd spent half his life on the battlefield. Knowing 300 years of the future doesn't help in battle. It's impossible for him to even hit him. Impossible, that's all. The man asked him contemptuously, is that all he can do? So he'll never protect what's precious to him. Of course he meant his daughter, Lisbeth. The protagonist dragged the weapon toward him with great effort and tried to use it to stand up. Lisbeth turned to him and begged him to stop. Let him back off. Tears welled in her eyes. The Marquis looked at his beloved daughter with a look of intense, irritated attention. Rudolph, struggling to his feet, thought, yes, he's already decided to defy fate. Until now, he'd only known that he wouldn't die until he turned 25. But now, Lisbeth was with him, and the course of history had changed. He was only the 4th prince. His life could be in danger at any moment. And Lisbeth, who was by his side, was in just as much danger as he was. That's why the Marquis wanted to show him how weak he was. The protagonist stood up, caught his breath, and resumed his fighting stance. Douglas grinned. Oh wow. MC realized he was testing him, wanting to know if he had enough strength and resolve to protect his daughter. Wiping his face, the protagonist said he hadn't given up yet. Mustering all his strength, he tried to attack Douglas again. The man noted that such a powerful lunge forward, even with such a wounded body, was something he could dodge with his eyes closed. The protagonist fiercely thrust his weapon forward to strike Douglas. The man, stunned, barely managed to parry the blow. Douglas thought in bewilderment. Just now, there had been bloodlust in his eyes. He had instinctively blocked the attack, but to that extent, he looked at his weapon and couldn't believe his eyes. What was this? His longtime comrade, the one who had undergone so much training, had been broken in half by the protagonist's blow, and the wooden sword touched his chest. Douglas looked at the impact site in surprise, not understanding what had happened. How had he managed to do it? In a rage, he threw the broken weapon away and struck the protagonist with all his might, putting all his strength into the blow. Rudolph simply went limp and fell. Lisbeth called out to him in fear, but he no longer heard her. Sometime later, he lay in his chambers, covered in wounds. At this point, Lisbeth turned furiously to her father and asked if there was any need to go so far. Douglas calmly replied, he admits, yes, he went too far, but given His Highness's position, he had to check whether he could trust him with his daughter. He needed to see for himself. The prince's swordsmanship was only an amateur. He believed he had never received any training before. Lisbeth exclaimed indignantly, it's not Rudolph's fault. They're constantly watching him and making fun of him. Her father replied, he knows it. He showed her his broken sword and invited her to look at it. Douglas declared that his wooden sword hadn't broken by accident. The prince had broken it on purpose. The girl stared at her father in bewilderment. The man continued, noticing how worn it was. His Highness had decided to break it completely. From the outside, it might have looked like the prince was swinging randomly, but in fact, he was always aiming for the same spot. Lisbeth looked at her father in surprise, not interrupting. Douglas said of course, it was risky, since the sword might not break, but that wasn't the point. The prince immediately noticed the wear on the sword. He didn't lose his nerve even in the face of a superior opponent. He had intelligence and the determination not to lose. That was the point. Lisbeth asked him, what then? Douglas said with satisfaction, His Highness is a diamond in its pristine, uncut form. His warrior blood hadn't boiled like this in a long time. After a while, the protagonist groaned. Lisbeth leaned over him and addressed him by name. He opened his eyes and, groaning, tried to rise. The girl helped him. She noted that it was still too early for him to move. Only now did the protagonist realize that he was lying in her lap. He thought in a panic, close, very close. They were only just betrothed. Wasn't it too early for this? Or was this normal for aristocrats of this era? What should he do? The girl was embarrassed by his closeness. MC decided, after all, this was abnormal. He couldn't do this. If the Marquis saw this, he'd be furious and ask him what he was doing with his daughter. Then he asked the girl exactly how the fight ended. Did he manage to hit him? Lisbeth cupped his face in her hands and told him that Prince Rudolph had the potential to become a king. She told him how her father had surprised her. He exclaimed angrily. His unbreakable spirit, insight, and tactical thinking were impressive. That made the way he was being treated in the imperial palace even sadder. He turned decisively and got ready to leave. Lisbeth turned to him anxiously, asking what he was planning. Douglas said that simply standing aside and watching wouldn't work. After all, we're talking about his precious children, his daughter and son, who were his inspiration and support. The girl gasped. So he was going to the guest hall? Douglas asked her to stay with the prince and let him deal with the guests. She could give it to Rodolfo. The girl laughed softly and concluded that he had won, and it seemed he had received her father's approval. The protagonist exhaled and thanked God that everything had turned out this way. Lisbeth stroked his face and said, he worked hard. The protagonist, with a happy expression, answered that it was so. At that moment, Maya was almost in tears, exclaiming indignantly, but she wanted to go too. It was Lady Lisbeth's birthday. She would like to see the prince give this to the girl. After all, she was the one who bought the gift for Lisbeth at the protagonist's request. He turned to her and said that he wanted her, Maya, to find him a ring, preferably with an aquamarine. It would suit Lisbeth very well. The maid took the toy, pretending it was Rodolfo, and she herself was Lisbeth. Shaking the teddy bear, she said, mimicking the protagonist's voice, darling, this aquamarine will look perfect on her finger. Putting the toy aside, she mimicked the girl's voice and replied, oh my God, Prince, it's beautiful. His personal maid must have found it. Maya picked up the bear again, shook it, and said, he can't find the words to express his gratitude to this wonderful girl who cares for him. And then she mimicked herself, as if answering him sheepishly, oh, what's wrong with him? And now, at that very moment, the protagonist thought of Maya and mentally apologized to her for not being able to give Lisbeth her gift right now. Thrilled by the sight of his head resting in her lap and the girl stroking his face, he thought, now he wanted to prolong this moment of unity with his beloved just a little longer. According to Rudolph, 2 weeks had passed since Lisbeth's eventful birthday. He was sitting in the park with Lisbeth. She put the ring on her finger and happily thanked him. She would cherish this ring. Maya smiled awkwardly and exclaimed, the ring really is beautiful. A clever maid must have chosen it. The protagonist said he wanted to give it to her for her birthday and apologized for not having time. Lisbeth exclaimed that so much had happened that day. Maya smiled and said she was surprised then that she returned with a swollen face. Lisbeth remarked that she had been busy since then and was glad they were finally able to see each other. The protagonist remarked, not seeing her, that he felt so heavy at heart. Maya watched their love scene in bewilderment and said, she's actually here too. She cleared her throat sharply, and they pulled away in fear. Maya smiled and asked Rudolph what his plans were. He replied that they needed to talk and would like to ask her for help. Suddenly, he rose from his chair and left. Maya asked him not to worry. There was no one here who could eavesdrop. He thought, on the contrary, he wished the enemy could eavesdrop on them, but since she said so, there was no one, nothing could be done. In fact, he was thinking of teaming up with someone. Lisbeth asked in surprise. Who? MC agreed, with one of his older brothers. Supported by the central aristocracy, skilled in managing foreign and domestic policy, firm and reliable. Possessing financial potential and natural charisma, First Prince Frederick. Although the Queen's second son, he has secured the support of the military aristocracy. In an emergency, his influence outweighs that of Frederick, Second Prince Oscar. He protects the western border and is key to trade, betrothed to the daughter of Margrave Andishan, Third Prince Robin. Each of them aspires to the imperial throne, coveting the power of the Farkrantz family, the empire's most powerful military force. Until now, he held no power. But after his engagement to Lisbeth, he became a key player in the struggle for the throne. His influence could tip the balance of power significantly, one way or the other. Lisbeth said that for the three princes, an alliance with Rudolf is the shortest path to the imperial throne. Maya asked, so he wants to increase his position in the imperial palace through this alliance? He said he's not interested in the throne or his position in the palace. He wants to forge an alliance with someone who can ensure his safety. Or rather, that's what he wants others to think. Lisbeth noted that this means he's been worried about spies recently. The protagonist agreed that if the brother's spies overheard the conversation, they would understand he has no ill intent. If so, he would have contacted them himself, or so he thought. But now there's no one to convey this. Maya had spoken contentedly, so it was her turn. The protagonist happily asked if he could rely on her. She happily agreed. Rumors were her thing, so he could leave that to her. Lisbeth paused, and the MC apologized to her for trying to exploit her family. She said she didn't mind, but his story made it clear he had no interest in the imperial throne. So, how did he envision his future? Rodolfo said he didn't need the throne or the royal title. He'd prefer a quiet life somewhere in the countryside. He'd started thinking this way after he was poisoned. Lisbeth asked, is it any different now? The protagonist thought, now he has someone he's obligated to protect, even if he leaves for the countryside. Over time, those who will seek to exploit his position and kill him will appear, so this isn't enough. He needs the strength to resist any evil, to protect himself and his loved ones. Maya thought, this path won't be easy. Suddenly, Lisbeth began to giggle and thought, his eyes full of determination to overcome the thorns. That was a stupid question for him. Just like that day, his heart was still strong. He would succeed. He was a prince, and he was strong. Meanwhile, in the Zodiac Palace, Douglas approached the Emperor and thanked him for allowing him to meet. The Emperor asked, without further ado, what was his business with him. He explained that it was about Prince Rudolf and his daughter Lisbeth, both 14 years old, and they would likely enter the Imperial Academy next year. Therefore, until then, he would like to accept the prince into the Farkhan's household, so that they could build a better relationship. He thought that if the protagonist was out of favor at court, he should be protected outside the palace. A whole year would be enough to properly temper the prince. The Emperor refused, and Douglas asked in surprise, why not? The Emperor said that, after all, the protagonist was Prince Baldic of the Empire. He would not allow him to live under the protection of a subordinate house. Beatrice would grieve if her beloved son disappeared. Douglas thought with displeasure that Fox wouldn't even consider such a thing. Douglas said he understood and offered him a compromise, allowing Lisbeth to remain with His Highness and, in addition, allowing his daughter's companions to enter the palace. He considered that sending Lisbeth to the palace was a decision he made with a heavy heart. He could not sacrifice the prince, who would become like a son to him. Lisbeth was strong. She would not feel constrained even here. He could come to the palace every day to betroth the prince. The Emperor said there was no choice, and Douglas asked, will he allow it? He replied, after he explained everything, was there something about Rudolf that made him say that? Douglas agreed. He had recently had the opportunity to compete with the prince. The Emperor asked in bewilderment, wasn't fighting an obsidian demon reckless on the part of the protagonist? Douglas wondered if His Majesty was interested. Even though he had incredible personal difficulties, he still loved the prince like a son. If the prince had a mentor, he might eventually surpass even him. The Emperor said, as expected, he knew from the start that MC had talent. Douglas thought in disbelief. This wasn't the face of a caring parent proud of his child. What was going on? If he had been aware of the prince's talent, he would have actively nurtured it. It would be beneficial for the imperial family too. Why wasn't the Emperor doing this? Douglas turned to leave and begged him to excuse him. The Emperor called out to him and said, regarding his daughter, it would be a duty. Douglas ran out of the palace, thinking about how Rudolf had deliberately subjected himself to humiliation. Why had his own father neglected him? He ignored the talented prince, creating an environment where he was belittled. Then he has a plan. Meanwhile, at the palace, the protagonist asked Lisbeth if it was okay that it had been so long. Her father might be worried. Lisbeth smiled and said it was fine. From now on, she would be living in the Scorpion Palace. Confused, the protagonist asked Maya if she knew. She told him not to worry, as she had already prepared a room for her. He exclaimed in displeasure, that's not it. You should have warned me. Lisbeth exclaimed in horror, How could you lie to a prince? And apologized. They're in trouble. Meanwhile, at dinner, the butler turned to Robin and said he had a meeting with Lady Shira the following afternoon. What about the clothes and the gift? Robin said angrily that they were responsible for that, and ordered him not to ask unnecessary questions, or he would kill him. The assistant asked permission to wipe his face after dinner and said he was being kind today. Besides, wouldn't it be better to find an excuse to make fun of MC? He heard he was looking for a bride. There was no one who would marry this prince. The butler awkwardly called out to Robin and said that Rudolph had assaulted the daughter of the Farkrantz family's Margrave. Robin, surprised, asked who it was. The assistant said it would be the Douglas family. Robin became angry and, spilling food on the butler, angrily asked, "Is the bride from such a good family? How could this filthy prince be so impudent? With such influence, he would become much more powerful, so he wouldn't allow it. He couldn't let this filth get above him. He would ruin Rudolph's engagement at any cost." The next day, after Rudolph woke up, Elizabeth greeted him and wished him good morning. According to him, starting yesterday, Elizabeth would live in the palace for a whole year. He thought excitedly, she was so beautiful. Was he the happiest man in the world? That black hair fluttering in the wind and that fair skin, like a work of art. Meanwhile, Elizabeth thought shyly, how charming Prince Rudolph was. Is she the happiest girl in the world? Silver hair, amber eyes sparkling in the morning light, just like a living marble statue. And all this so early in the morning, their hearts couldn't take it. Sometime later, at breakfast, Maya asked if he'd left out the carrots again. The protagonist noted with alarm that it was just a couple of pieces. Maya said that wasn't right. If he didn't eat enough, he wouldn't grow properly. He exclaimed with displeasure, "He's not a child." Maya replied, "If he's not a child, he should eat everything that's put in." The chef, watching this, happily remarked that in the past, cooks who added carrots were immediately fired. Although Maya, who argues to the end, is also a good girl. The butler awkwardly remarked that he seemed to have cast off all his negativity. Perhaps it was after that assassination attempt, or perhaps it was because of the engagement. Lisbeth picked up a carrot with her fork and asked, "Does he really not like carrots? If it's too much for him, can she eat the rest?" Maya called out to her and said there was no need to spoil his highness like that. She said it was okay. Lisbeth thought the chefs were pleased when food was eaten with pleasure. Suddenly, MC abruptly ate the rest of the food, and Maya asked in surprise, "His highness ate the carrots? It's a real miracle. If he has a bride like that, then everything will be fine with the prince." The cook breathed a sigh of relief. What a relief. And he was afraid he would be fired. The butler noted that last time, almost half the servants had been laid off. Maya had fired the servant who treated the prince with hostility. The protagonist called out to Lisbeth and asked if she had no other plans. Perhaps they could take a short walk after breakfast. He wanted to show her a place. If she was tired, she didn't have to force herself. Lisbeth exclaimed happily. A walk was a great idea, even right now. He wondered if he had suggested it strangely. Meanwhile, Lisbeth thought that the prince himself had invited her. They went out into the garden, and she looked around in surprise. This place. Rodolfo asked if she remembered this. Lisbeth, with tears in her eyes, agreed. Everything here was the same as 9 years ago, when she first met him. Lisbeth took his hand and, sitting on the ground, he made a wreath of flowers for her. Rodolfo suggested they go back. Maya had probably already made tea. Lisbeth agreed, when suddenly she apologized and said she'd left her umbrella. The protagonist said he'd run off and look for it. She remarked that everything was fine, and asked him to go back without her. But was he worried about her? He awkwardly asked not to tease him and watched Lisbeth go. Suddenly, Robin appeared behind him and smugly said, "What a meeting." He didn't expect to see him here. The protagonist turned sharply and wondered what he was doing here. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. They said he'd been suspended after the incident. Robin said the suspension had already been lifted, and he dared to humiliate him back then. The protagonist wondered, "So this is all for revenge?" Robin said he didn't care. He was magnanimous after all. They said he was engaged now, with a girl from a very influential family. They say she's also a stunning beauty, although he's a common dirty pig. Rodolphe thought about it, so Robin started it. He thought the brothers would intervene sooner or later. What does he mean by that? He won't touch him if he introduces him to the Falkrantz family? Robin contentedly ordered him to give him his fiancée. The protagonist was horrified. He didn't understand him. He also had a fiancée. Was he going to cheat on her even before the wedding? Robin said that in the royal family, a couple of concubines is common. After all, he was the son of a concubine himself, so he should keep quiet and listen to him carefully. He would never allow him to have anything for himself. She would be his too, and his fiancée was no exception. The protagonist looked at him with disgust and thought he was even more vile, primitive, and disgusting. What was he thinking? Here was the third prince, Robin, in all his glory. He probably doesn't need the Falkrantz family's power. He simply cannot bear to see him rising in life. He asked him to stop, and Robin asked contentedly, "Are you trying to resist?" Robin swung his fist and exclaimed, "Now their brotherly brawl will begin." Suddenly, Lisbeth grabbed him by the collar with an umbrella handle and lifting him up slammed him hard onto the ground. Robin looked back in disbelief and asked, "What was that? How dare she? Does she even realize he's the third prince?" Lisbeth remarked, "Well, Prince Robin, he fell so suddenly, it even scared her." She was Lisbeth, the eldest daughter of the Falkrantz family, Prince Rudolph's fiancée. If anything happened to him, she would kill him, after which she softened and, with a smile on her face, said that's how much she respected and loved him. He should remember that. According to MC, they then told the servants that they found Robin unconscious and returned to Scorpio. Meanwhile, in Rodolfo's office, Maya asked angrily why they'd left her alone. If she'd been there, Robin wouldn't have come anywhere near her. How could she have missed that? The protagonist, perplexed, noted that she was giving herself away. He apologized. They just wanted to be alone. Lisbeth smiled, noting that he'd come with them next time. Maya spread her arms wide and said that an alliance with Robin was now out of the question. The protagonist remarked that he wasn't even considered, since he was already on Frederick's side. He was simply a scoundrel. He dared to touch his fiancée. Lisbeth asked, so he was planning to form an alliance with the second prince, Oscar? MC refused. His goal was the first prince, Frederick. Maya noted in surprise, but if they joined him, Robin would be there. They would end up on the same team with that fool? Rudolph said everything was fine, and he knew it. Robin was insanely jealous of Frederick. He had an inferiority complex. Frederick was the ideal, superior in every way. Looks, intelligence, strength, and charisma. Their mother, Queen Alicia, idolized only Frederick and expected nothing from Robin. He had such a complex that he was constantly looking for someone he could consider inferior. How do they think he'd feel if a pig like him stood next to Frederick? He'd already lost Rudolph, whom he considered weaker than himself. His fragile self-esteem would simply crumble. He couldn't bear being a nobody. He'd ally with Frederick and rise above him. He'd definitely turn against him. Lisbeth asked excitedly, would it really be that simple? Frederick would logically enlist the support of Robin, his own brother. It seemed more advantageous than an alliance with him, the fourth prince. The protagonist replied that he would likely ally with him, or rather, with Lord Falkrantz, who stood behind him, because Frederick lacked his own military power. This was also stated in the chronicles. Frederick was politically strong, especially in the center, but in the event of a conflict, Oscar had the military advantage. He was supported by military forces. They balanced each other, and in the original story, both died at the hands of Rudolph. Most of the Margraves of the North and South were on Oscar's side, meaning he could attack the center from two sides at once. That's why Frederick couldn't act against him. And to strengthen his power, he needed an army, and House Falkrantz had one. Lisbeth smiled and said she was impressed by him. Such profound analysis. A true strategist. Maya said happily, as if he'd seen it all firsthand. MC chuckled and thought, well, he can't just say he knows the plot. Be that as it may, until Frederick himself contacts them, they will wait. After which he called out to Lisbeth and thanked her for saving him back then, but she mustn't put herself in danger. He, too, would try to become stronger. Lisbeth abruptly left the office and said, it's okay. She's prepared. Rodolph watched her go and thought, he really does want her to be careful, especially because of Robin. He has a bad feeling about this and hopes he's right. 10 days passed, and Robin stood around the corner of the castle and thought angrily, is that girl really living with that piglet in the Scorpion Palace? Until next year, until they enter the Imperial Academy. The enforcer said he'd follow them and get a duplicate key. Robin looked at the key and thought, this idiot Rudolph and his bride think he will forget about everything? She's too valuable for such a worthless thing, but everything he has is his. He'll make them both understand who's the real boss here. He snuck into Lisbeth's room and said it was all his fault. Everything he held dear he would destroy with his own hands. Suddenly, Lisbeth woke up and slammed Robin hard, sending him flying to the end of the room. Then, grabbing him by the collar, she began slapping him across the face. A few minutes later, Rodolfo said he hadn't expected everything to go so smoothly. Lisbeth smiled. She'd said everything would be fine. Robin's servants began to sincerely repent and beg for forgiveness, at least for their lives. The protagonist asked who they were. Maya said they were the bad guys watching the palace. They'd recently captured them. He asked if these were the same ones who had been here before. It was good that Maya had noticed them then. She smiled and said it was all thanks to his instructions. 9 days ago, Maya came to the protagonist and said there seemed to be rats in the palace. Should she eliminate them? MC asked to leave them for now. In terms of timing, these are Robin's people, and he is clearly trying to spy on him through the servants. He suggested they leave a way out so they could do their job. Maya, on the other hand, should keep an eye on them so they would understand what Robin was up to. Rudolph said with displeasure, although when he learned that their goal was the key to Lisbeth's bedroom, he actually started shaking. Lisbeth smiled awkwardly and asked, she said she'd figure it out herself, didn't she? Robin called out to them angrily and asked how they dared tie him up. He is the second prince, so they should untie him immediately. He ordered him not to think it would end so easily. The butler angrily asked Robin to calm down. How many times had they tried to dissuade him? They asked him to stop fighting with Prince Rudolph and get down to business. Robin angrily ordered him to be quiet. A servant doesn't dare contradict his master. The butler exclaimed with displeasure. They agreed to steal the key because he said they'd simply intimidate the protagonist. They couldn't even imagine that he seriously intended to sneak in at night. Robin exclaimed, he should have taught that pathetic piglet a lesson and put him in his place. And with that girl, he's much more suitable for her. Lisbeth awkwardly began to stretch her arms and asked, what a bastard. Maybe they should make it so he can't walk anymore. Maya said she'd help her. MC fearfully asked them to stop. He'd be happy to, but it wasn't worth it. they shouldn't risk it. They'd simply hand them over to His Majesty. Having his own fiancée, he snuck into the palace and tried to infiltrate his brother's fiancée at night. The engagement was broken, and he faced either years in prison or scandal and exile from the imperial family. All he needed was for Robin to disappear from his path, and most importantly, for Lisbeth to be unharmed. He thought about it, but one thing still worried him. Robin's servants seemed to be acting against their will, but the punishment for such things was execution. They might even get worse than Robin. Suddenly, the butler ran into the office and said they had a problem. The protagonist asked fearfully, "What happened?" Suddenly, he noticed Robin and Frederick's mother, the Empire's first Empress consort, Alicia, standing in front of him. She greeted him and said they hadn't seen each other in a while. The protagonist wondered if her spies had reported everything to her, and how quickly. MC spread his arms wide and asked what he owed the visit to. Suddenly, Robin started shouting behind him, and Alicia said with a smile that she heard the shouting. That's why she came. What was all that noise? It could damage his reputation, depending on the situation. Lisbeth worriedly asked Maya what this meant. She replied that the prince who runs the Scorpio Palace is responsible for everything that happens here. Rudolph thought that she had attacked first, which meant she already knew Robin was here. The thing was, rats had gotten into the palace last night. He had already caught them. They were making noise and wouldn't calm down. He thought he should seize the opportunity in this conversation. Alicia asked contentedly, "Troublesome rats." If he wouldn't give these rats to her, she was just about to get a couple of pets in the tourist palace. The protagonist thought, her goal is to save Robin, not so quickly. He said, that's already difficult. If he just lets them go, he won't be able to justify himself to the Emperor. As she just said, he is responsible for this palace. Alicia smiled and asked, "Is that true? If she is the first Empress consort, she will take them. The Emperor will understand if everything is explained." MC thought, cunningly said, but if he gives Robin to her, everything will definitely be hushed up, and Robin's servants will then be completely removed, no matter what they say. He has 3 conditions for her. If she fulfills them, he will hand Robin over to her. Lisbeth thought in surprise. He is using the prince himself as a bargaining chip? Alicia asked, 3 conditions? He seems to want a lot. Rodolfo said he was definitely going to meet her halfway, even at risk to himself. She should consider herself lucky. Alicia asked if she would listen to him, and what were the conditions? He said, first, she must keep Robin away from the Imperial Palace, and let him not interfere in the Scorpion Palace anymore. Alicia smiled and said the first was no problem. Even better. After all, he had long dreamed of living in a student dorm, but was he sure about the second? Pretend as if nothing had happened? The protagonist said he was sure, but by nothing, he meant everything would remain as it was before last night. That is, everyone from the tourist palace who happened to be here would also leave, and everything would remain as before. Alicia said thoughtfully, unexpectedly, but the second condition was also acceptable. The protagonist thought about whether it was true that executing everyone who simply followed orders too much would be beneficial to her. Robin's servants had the fewest enemies. It was in the interests of both parties. She asked, what about the third condition? She hoped it would be reasonable, too. MC said she knew his position in the palace was extremely precarious, and that was only natural. His mother was just a concubine, and she dared to covet the throne for her illegitimate son. It was like asking for jewels she didn't deserve. No one would accept him here, so naturally he was a target. Alicia asked what exactly he meant by that. Did he want to improve his situation? He apologized for being so evasive. Suddenly, Lisbeth grabbed the hem of his cloak and said he simply wanted to say that he knew his place and wanted to live a quiet and peaceful life, away from the heavy burden of succession. That's what he thought until now. But by attacking Lisbeth, he unexpectedly gained the support of the Falkrantz family. He thought this was a wonderful opportunity to mend fences with his brothers, who hadn't been so close before. The protagonist thought she'd gotten the hint, and his intentions were obvious. His third request was to facilitate his alliance with Frederick and act as a mediator between them. What would she say to that? Alicia grinned and said, who would have thought that when she came here to pick up the rats, she would hear such a request from Rudolph? She would gladly accept all his requests, and Frederick would be happy too. He had always worried about him. Rudolph thanked her with a smile, thinking, well, she said, this cold-blooded person was completely uninterested in him. Including the rats? Could he trust her with everything else? Alicia agreed, and he said he would go. She asked if she could ask him one last question. The protagonist agreed, and she asked how he felt about his mother. He replied that he didn't feel anything about her. He didn't feel anything. She was her. He was him. Alicia went into the protagonist's office, and after the door closed, heart-rending sounds were heard from inside. They turned around and looked worriedly in that direction. A few days later, Douglas and the protagonist were training. He said it was a difficult situation, and then Alicia. Rudolph noted that they said she immediately sent Robin's older brother to the student dorm. Now Robin will no longer be able to interfere in their lives, and Lisbeth will be able to live safely. Douglas remarked that he personally considered this too lenient a decision. He said they would finish training for today, and the protagonist agreed. According to the MC, since Lisbeth arrived, Margraf Falkrantz has been personally teaching him fencing, and for him, this is a real gift from fate, because he wants to become physically stronger so he can protect her. He feels embarrassed that a weakling like him is wasting the Margrave's time. He needs to work hard to get even a little stronger. Lisbeth exclaimed in displeasure. Since Her Highness Alicia personally came to them, they had no choice but to hand over Robin. Moreover, she thinks they couldn't have achieved a better outcome. Maya said it was exactly as Lisbeth said. Giving Robin over without conditions would have meant their defeat. If they hadn't compromised, a conflict would have arisen between them and Empress Alicia. Douglas said he understood this without them. He wasn't at all bothered by the fact that he used his name in the negotiations. Lisbeth remarked with displeasure, but from the outside, it seemed like they were being overly strict during training. Douglas asked, so they thought he was angry? Quite the contrary. He was so pleased with His Highness's impressive successes. They say that Prince Rudolph has a right to the throne, but he has no desire to occupy the imperial throne. The protagonist agreed, precisely because he has no interest in the imperial throne. He's even less interested in the imperial family itself. Perhaps the Marquis has some plans for his status in the imperial family, but he can't live up to those expectations. Although besides his position in the imperial family, he has no other virtues. Douglas said that was wonderful, but he didn't know if he knew that besides Lisbeth, their Falkrantz family had no other heirs. So when Lisbeth became engaged to him, they considered adopting an heir from a side branch. Wouldn't he be willing to become an adopted son of the Falkrantz family? The protagonist was surprised and thought that if he became the Marquis's adopted son, he would be freed from his status as the imperial family. He asked if he was sure he was suitable for them. After all, he had no merits and was completely weak. Douglas laughed. What was he talking about? Even though they had only recently begun training, he was already demonstrating excellent analytical and reactive skills. If he continues training and gains basic physical strength and endurance, within 6 months, he'll be able to surpass swordsmen his age. The protagonist awkwardly noted that he was clearly exaggerating. Douglas, displeased, said he never lied about strength. Lisbeth added that her father spoke the pure truth. She was certain that in the future he would surpass even his father in swordsmanship. She was convinced of it. Maya smiled. He had negotiated well with Princess Alicia, and above all, he had a kind heart, capable of showing compassion even to enemy servants. Douglas asked if neither his daughter nor his subordinates considered him worthless, right? Lisbeth asked him not to think he was useless. To her, he was irreplaceable and precious. MC thought, so he finally had a real family. Meanwhile, in the Sworja mansion, in the Memorial Hall, a man tearfully asked, "Why him, Patrick? Why did he die? He was the heir." Wilhelm wondered if they considered him a nuisance because he was born a redhead, and that damned father who always adored his twin brother was the reason. Now his beloved Patrick was gone, and he would inherit the Svaria family. The man exclaimed angrily, wishing that fool Wilhelm had died instead. Suddenly, Wilhelm killed the man and laughed. He would become a hero whose name would go down in history, and he would definitely succeed, because he knew a story no one else knew. 3 months after the negotiations with Empress Alicia, Rodolfo and Lisbeth were training, then sat down to rest. She said he had become much stronger. He wiped his face and said it was all thanks to her father and her. Maya peeked around the corner and happily said that they both had trained well today. She called out to the protagonist and said that he had received a letter. The protagonist asked in surprise, "Is it from Empress Alicia?" Lisbeth asked. "So this is about mending relations with Prince Frederick?" Maya inquired, "What is she writing?" MC said the Imperial New Year's reception would be held next week, and that's where he would meet his brother. A week later, an event was held at the Imperial Palace on the Golden Path. Karl first came out onto the balcony and thanked everyone for finding the time to gather there today. He proposed to welcome the beginning of the new year of their Baltic Empire together, and now he would introduce his family, and asked everyone to greet them with thunderous applause. The first Empress, Alicia, the second Empress, Katerina, and the favorite, Beatrice, walked down the red carpet. She apologized for being late. She was a little late. She couldn't decide on her makeup. Everyone looked at her disapprovingly, and then began whispering that, vulgar as always, she was a disgrace to the entire imperial family. What is His Highness thinking? Then Prince Frederick and Prince Oscar came out. Frederick, cold and handsome as ever. They say he's the top student at the Imperial Academy. Prince Oscar is also good, and they say that he is even stronger than Frederick in fencing. And there are rumors about Robin, apparently for good reason. They said his engagement to House Anderson was broken off, and Empress Alicia must be having a hard time. Suddenly, Rudolph and Lisbeth came out onto the red carpet, after which the others began to vigorously discuss them. So are the rumors about his engagement to Falkrantz's daughter true? Why him? They say he seems to have become a different person after the assassination attempt. His very existence is a stain on the imperial family, and what if he gains power but supposedly is adopted into House Falkrantz? Then he will lose his right to the throne, but part of the family will remain. If this is true, the balance between the heirs depends on who supports Rudolph, Prince Frederick's faction or Prince Oscar's, and will Rudolph join? Lisbeth called out to the protagonist. Rumors had spread as expected, albeit unpleasantly. He said it was all thanks to Maya. It was better to let them watch his every move. Meanwhile, Beatrice looked at the protagonist with displeasure and thought that with all the attention focused on her, this was the best moment. Suddenly, Oscar approached him and congratulated him on his engagement. The protagonist awkwardly thanked him, Lisbeth introduced herself, and Oscar asked if they could step aside to talk alone. He was old enough to drink, wasn't he? MC apologized, but he had already promised someone else and asked to talk another time. Suddenly, Alicia came up to Oscar and said that Prince Frederick was waiting for Rudolph, after which she pulled them aside. The protagonist thought, excellent move. He, who had previously been ignored, was now the first one to be called by his older brother. Now the aristocrats will understand what this means. Prince Rudolph has sided with Frederick. If this reaches the nobility, rumors about him will disappear, and he's one step closer to a peaceful life. He mentally apologized to Oscar for turning him down, although perhaps he simply wanted to use him so he shouldn't feel guilty. Meanwhile, Oscar was standing outside when Alicia came to him and asked if he'd been rejected. He replied that he wasn't upset at all. Previously, the protagonist hadn't known how to handle politics, but now he was different. And now he wanted him even more. Alicia said it wasn't like him to get so carried away. Did he really need him that much? Oscar angrily said, to destroy the amber-eyed imperial family and take their place. Rudolph, Lisbeth, and Alicia came to the table where Frederick sat. He thought about how little was actually known about him. Even in the military chronicles, Wilhelm had mentioned him. He was killed early by the tyrant Rudolph. Alicia asked with a smile, this is the first time they've spoken like this, face to face, isn't it? Frederick agreed, and the protagonist thought about how confidently he responded. Even though it was their first time speaking, they'd seen each other before. It was just then that Empress Alicia was having tea, and the children they brought with them were playing in the garden. Robin, mocking the protagonist, had said contentedly that today he'd been promoted from a pig to a horse. Why was he lying around? He should get up and run. The other children, seeing Frederick, said decisively, when he grows up, can she take him as a servant? That's unfair. He wants to too, and she wants to be his wife. Robin said discontentedly that if they wanted to talk to Frederick's brother, they should ask him first. MC thought, what luck. He was so different from him. Frederick asked, but what could they offer him by becoming his servants? The children replied, he'll become his right hand and help him, and he'll protect him. She'll make a beautiful wife and comfort him. Frederick said, meaning that being friends with them is of no use to him at all. They distract him from his book. Rudolph lay on the ground, wondering why he could so calmly refuse something he so desperately wanted. Cold, logical, and ruthless, he only does what benefits him. That's the first Prince Frederick. He didn't even remember meeting him, meaning he was nothing to him, but now he's different. Gathering his resolve, the protagonist said he was honored he'd found the time. He and House Falkrantz wanted to support him. And besides, the Margrave had already agreed. Now he had power he didn't have before, because he was now a man capable of influencing House Falkrantz's decisions. The guests, seeing them, asked if Prince Frederick intended to accept the protagonist into his faction. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. Alicia asked, how reliable, isn't it? Frederick remarked that he understood. She asked MC if he would soon be entering the Imperial Academy, right? Frederick had already graduated. Did he want to ask about life at the Academy? Rudolph agreed. They say Brother Frederick was the student council president, and he greatly respects him as a role model. He'd like to know how a student should approach his studies. Even in this pointless conversation, he's forced to participate. Frederick asked if the conversation with him was over. He asked them to forgive him, but he had a meeting with other aristocrats ahead. The protagonist was surprised. He had been too naive and self-confident. He himself had never had any value. His value was House Falkrantz, which stood behind him. And now that he had already formed an alliance with House Falkrantz, he no longer needed to talk to them. And why was he so surprised? Did he really hope that by hiding behind someone's authority, he could prove anything to them? He, whom Frederick hadn't even noticed that day, thought he'd talk to him now, just because he had a powerful family behind him? Lisbeth took his hand and encouraged him not to worry. She was always there for him. Alicia worriedly asked him to forgive him. He smiled. Everything was fine. His older brother was just busy. Yes, this meeting was just a show for the public, just a performance. The goal had been achieved. There was nothing more to worry about. Alicia said she'd forgotten to say something important. She felt he'd gotten too little in return. If he needed anything, he could just say it. MC asked in surprise, is that really possible? She agreed. They were allies now, even if she didn't look it. But she was still the first empress, so she had some power. Rudolph thought she was stricter, so he'd take her up on her offer. Suddenly, a glass of drink flew at him, but he dodged it and it smashed against the wall. Beatrice called out to him angrily, asking if he'd been sitting late today. He usually just greeted the emperor and left. The butler tried to stop her. She'd had too much to drink. But she slapped him sharply and asked him to leave this ugly woman alone. It would be better if they had a private, family-style conversation, wouldn't it? The protagonist wondered if she'd changed so drastically. What was going on in her mind? But they didn't have anything to talk about. A family-style conversation, did they? Wasn't she always with His Majesty? Beatrice smiled and said that His Majesty was busy with business. He wasn't present, but something else was more important right now. She gave him a quick hug, but he pushed her away. Beatrice asked in surprise, what? He's resisting? MC wondered, perplexed. What was wrong with her? She had never even hugged him as a child. Beatrice looked sad and apologized to him for not paying him enough attention. She had also struggled, having been born into a poor family, noble by title it seemed, but in reality, her father had failed everything. They lost their lands, were left with nothing. She scraped by under various masters, changing job after job. Those were hellish days. At some point, she was taken into service in a noble house, which is how she ended up in the palace. And that's when his father, the emperor, first noticed her, and then he was born. She was just an impoverished aristocrat, and her family had neither title nor influence. But that's precisely why she clung to the imperial family. She did everything for him, so that he could live a better life. She was terrified that the emperor might turn his back on them, but it wasn't all for her. Her greatest fear was that he too would become useless, that he would be left without a place in this world. Rudolph said it was a lie. Then why had she abandoned him too? She preferred to be by the emperor's side, and when he asked for help, she called him weak. Why had she even given birth? Of course, to remain in the imperial family, she said so herself. Was she saying that even these words were for his sake? Beatrice laughed and asked, "I wonder who he takes after." He replied that he is he. Why had she arranged all this? Beatrice smiled and noted that she would say it frankly. He was going to marry this girl. Was that some kind of mistake? If he marries her, he will lose his title of prince. He should think carefully about whose efforts allowed him to remain in the imperial family in the first place. The protagonist wondered in bewilderment. Was the imperial family thanks to her? He had been through so much because of that status. For her, being part of the imperial family was the only meaning in life. She cares that he remains a prince, that's all, so she simply clings to power and status. MC laughed and remarked, meaning he had unknowingly made the best choice. Beatrice asked angrily why he was laughing so much. She grabbed her glass and angrily ordered him not to laugh. Lisbeth appeared before her and introduced herself. She asked her stepmother to tell her what she planned to do with her master. Beatrice angrily asked, since when had she been a stepmother? She didn't even show up for the engagement. Everyone could already see what a country bumpkin and pathetic woman she was. Lisbeth, maintaining her composure, asked if she could consider her words an insult to the house of Marquise Falkrantz. Rudolph said he just wants to be with the woman he loves, and that she had no right to tell him what to do. But if his engagement was causing her pain, then at least that would be his small consolation. And then he asked for forgiveness. Beatrice got angry and threw a glass of drink at them with all her might, when Empress Alicia suddenly shielded them. MC called out to her in fear, wondering why she'd shielded him. Alicia said Beatrice was truly a pathetic woman. As soon as His Majesty left, chaos ensued. She disgraced her beloved imperial family every day. She ordered her to go back to her chambers with the concubines. Afterwards, Alicia apologized to the guests for the scene, suggesting they continue the New Year's celebration as expected, with flair. Beatrice walked past Rodolfo and said she would never accept this wedding. She would destroy them, no matter the cost. Lisbeth looked at him in bewilderment, and he said it was just a mosquito buzzing, not worth paying attention to. The protagonist took out a handkerchief and called out to Alicia, saying she was bleeding. She asked him not to worry, but he replied that it was no small matter. Alicia said he was exaggerating. Suddenly, she noticed a wound on his forehead and said that he was bleeding, and that shards of glass had gotten into it. If it got infected, it would be bad. She asked the assistants to take him to the infirmary immediately. A few minutes later, the protagonist apologized for what happened. Alicia wrapped his head in a bandage and said that everything was fine now. But he should be careful, the wound could get infected. MC called out to her and asked why she covered him of all people. Alicia frowned and said that she hated Beatrice.